Hello everybody! Our presentation this week is on the New Realism, Neo-Dada, and pop art. These movements exhibit a group of trends in the art world, mostly during the 60s and 70s, of art that reintroduced recognizable or human content and were often preoccupied with mass culture and urban ideas. So what inspired these movements? These trends in the arts can be seen as a response of young artists to the inspired and absolute works of the abstract expressionists. The likes of de Kooning, Rothko, and Pollock didn't leave much space for emerging artists to innovate. Abstraction wasn't really an option for them unless they wanted to follow in one of the master's footsteps. And a return to more traditional figurative painting was also not really an option because they were so set on innovation. Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg stand as the major figures that are transitional in retrospect between abstract expressionism and pop art. They were heavily influenced by the ideas of this guy, composer John Cage, who called for an art that was not removed from life like abstract expressionism had been, but rather integrated with the everyday. Robert Rauschenberg, he removed himself from the traditions of automatism and spontaneity, which had come to be seen as the marks of true artistic genius and authenticity. He also created his own authenticity, which was founded in irony, instead of the emotion or sublime of abstract expressionism. He reintroduced collage, making pieces out of comic strips, photos, and rags. His work is sometimes reminiscent of de Kooning, who also used collage of popular imagery in his women's series. You guys are probably familiar with that story, and had a similar vicious brushstroke. Rauschenberg made this statement here that became a slogan for the New Realism. Painting relates to both art and life. Neither can be made. I try to act in the gap between the two. These ideas can be seen expressed in his work, like the one on the left here, which is Bed. In this piece, he combines art and life by hanging the pillow and blanket of his bed like a canvas. He then paints over top with a violent gestural stroke that just leaves drips of paint. Like I said, you can really see the action painting influence here. This makes this piece a great example of how Robert Rauschenberg bridges the gap between pop art and an action painting. This piece also ensured his notoriety. Well, in the spirit of John Cage, producing an art that was integral with modern life. A lot of Rauschenberg's other works followed a similar train of thought. He used everything from taxidermied animals to tires and assorted debris to create a visual language that was very real, but also that ran in direct opposition with the glamour promoted by his culture's media and the high art dogma of the time. Rauschenberg was also, he was one of the first visual artists to forge his way onto this new plane of expression. His art was often referred to as Neo-Dada, because of his ironic tone and use of found objects, which reminded critics of Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. The other artist that bridged this gap between abstract expressionism and pop art, in the States at least, was Jasper Johns. His first innovative piece, which you can see on the right here, is Target with plaster casts. In this piece, Johns made plaster casts of human faces and body parts and placed them in boxes above a perfectly drawn but heavily textured and caustic target. Like Rauschenberg, he also elevates the everyday, or as the textbook says, the banal, to the status of high art, a status that, thanks to abstract expressionism, had never been so distinguished. Like Rauschenberg, his work also earned him the title of Neo-Dadaist. So this brings us to pop art. Its founders called themselves the New Realists, and they were associated by critics with the Neo-Dada artists. The first public pop art exhibition was at New York's Sydney Gallery in 1962. That's where these images on the right are from. And it displayed the works of Roy Lichtenstein, Klaus Oldenburg, James Rosenquist, Andy Warhol, Tom Wisselman, and Robert Indiana. Killer cast, I know, right? Their works shocked the critics and public because of their informality and matter-of-fact aesthetic, barely changing their found, mostly commercial imagery. The works on display at the show were seen as attacks against the sophisticated innovations and hard-earned status of modern high art. So Roy Lichtenstein, I only really have time for one pop artist, but I wanted to demonstrate the final piece in this kind of evolutionary process. And after Warhol, Lichtenstein is probably the most widely recognized. In this piece, wham! 1963, in my opinion, is a really great example of the ideas behind the movement. In this piece, Lichtenstein takes a comic book image and enlarges it. By doing this, he transforms the fleeting, everyday action of the cartoon into something monumental, something static, high art. In this piece, he simultaneously questions these high art values of the time while making a commentary on representations of war to the younger generation. His use of the everyday and this kind of multi-purpose wit can be seen throughout the pop art movement. So as Neo-Dada was paving the way to a new form of expression in the States, a similar movement was also emerging in Europe, and that's Nouveau Realism, or New Realism. This movement was spearheaded by French art critic Pierre Restany and artist Yves Klein. And it was interested in the machine, technology, and urban ideas. Jean Tinguely, whose work you can see here, was an artist who worked alongside Klein, and his pieces were most obviously connected to the realities of urban life. This piece here is titled Pop, Hop, and Op & Co., and it combined everyday unesthetic materials into forms that demonstrate a mixture of creativity, wit, a formal mastery, and a very healthy dose of ridiculous humor. Obvious lines can be drawn between the works of Tinguely and that of Kurt Schwitter's Mertzbilds and the American junk sculptors. So back to the original question. What inspired Neo-Dada, New Realism, and pop art? I'll start off with this Caprow quote on the legacy of Pollock. Pollock left us at the point where we must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life. Not satisfied with the suggestion of our other senses offered by painting, we will look towards tactile experience. And you can really see this kind of attitude across all of these movements. There's a reunion of art and life, which manifests itself in a variety of ways, but is prevalent because non-figurative art had reached its conclusion in the likes of Pollock and Rothko. What these new generations of artists found was a way to bring back representation of reality, while still innovating away from traditional illusionism. These developments may also have something to do with the increased, well, they definitely had something to do with the increased amount of consumer goods and resulting skepticism of capitalist culture. This seems especially true in America, where many artists were caught up with the concepts of change and eventual obsolescence of goods. We can also see a new attitude of irony and pessimism, at least in my opinion, which could be a part of a greater trend towards postmodernism and the rejection of the meta-narrative. Okay, so we'll move on to institutional critiques. During the 60s, and this is another trend, during the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of discussion about the art world and the role of the museum and the gallery. The two leading thinkers in this discussion were American philosopher Arthur C. Danto, who you see on the top here, and French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who you see on the bottom. Danto saw the art world as a structure necessary to separate art from mere real things, whereas Bourdieu saw it as a result of social validation. Even though the two thinkers had slight differences here, they both agreed that art institutions were social ideological structures that gave meaning to the material structures, such as galleries, museums, and the pieces themselves. These discussions caused the new generation of artists to call into question and challenge the institutions which they were showing him. Michael Asher, Hans Hack, and Daniel Buren, whose names correspond with their images, are three artists that were forerunners of this new school of institutional critique. They used their spectators to complete the work, following in the footsteps of Marcel Duchamp and Roland Barthes, who was a very influential philosopher and linguist at the time. The spectators of their works were directed towards the institutional context that they were viewing the piece in. They were made to think of their environment as an ideological system, and then to think about that system in relation to the piece. Most of the critiques relied on the viewer's preconceptions that they had about the galleries and museums, and they used these preconceptions to create a response. A great example of one of these critiques can be seen in Burns' proposal for the 6th Guggenheim International. Burns seemed to find the power of the institution particularly controlling, and when he was invited to show at the Guggenheim International, he couldn't really let the opportunity pass. The International was an art exhibition or competition that began in 1956. It scouted worldwide for the next great artwork or artist. The organizers of the 6th International were looking for minimalist artists in an attempt to keep the trends of the avant-garde focused on the American developments. But they mistakenly qualified Burns' work as minimalism, which would lead to a last-minute expulsion of the piece. Burns was ideologically aligned with a neo-Marxist group called the Situationists. This group thought that art was dead and that the only thing left for so-called artists to do, in light of this fact, was to challenge the workings of the ideological state apparatuses, to use an Althusserian term, such as museums. The organizers discovered Burns' true intent when he insisted in an interview that he was not an artist, saying that both art and the museum, in the traditional sense, are obsolete. So if we look back at the piece with his kind of ideological background in mind, this large piece that is inside the gallery was a critique of the Guggenheim itself, which is set up architecturally to capture the viewer's attention through its kind of spiraling upwards orientation. The design of the building would also give the organizers complete control over the placement of works and flow of spectators. With this piece, Burns uses all of the building's attributes to his advantage. He uses the inherent self-centeredness of the Guggenheim's architecture to place the impetus on his work, which descends directly out of the focal point of the building's architecture. And no matter what floor you ascended to, the piece was never out of sight. Burns had taken back control from the institution, and in doing this, he points out the problems that are apparent in the particular space. The piece that is outside, because there was an identical piece that was hanging horizontally outside across the street. I couldn't find an image of it because I don't think there ever actually was one hanging outside because it got canceled. But with this kind of horizontally oriented one, Burns took what is seen as fine art in the Guggenheim and made it into a banner, a kind of cheap advertising gimmick of capitalist society. And in doing this, he calls into question the very nature and purpose of the museum itself, and reiterates his earlier statements about art's obsolescence. The Guggenheim officials, who were under a lot of pressure from the threat of a new traditional versus avant-garde conflict, that argued the avant-garde's destruction of tradition was an attempt to create anarchy and weaken the American society in the face of communist threat. It's all part of the Red Scare Cold War era. The Guggenheim officials had no choice but to request that Burns change his installation to something that was less obviously challenging of bourgeois institutions. When Burns refused, they cut him out of the show. So this is just one example of the institutional critiques prevalent in the 60s and 70s. I don't want to make it look like these critiques were always Marxist attacks on bourgeois structures, or even necessarily attacks at all. What these critiques did on a fundamental level was place the viewer in a position between the institution and the artist or artwork in a sort of Barthesian attempt to give the viewer the chance to consider the relationship and form their own conclusions based on that specific juxtaposition.
After World War II ended, there was an economic boom in America. The economy grew by 37%. The gross national product increased from $200 billion to $500 billion. Rates of unemployment were low and consumerism was at an all-time high, especially in the voracious middle class. Advertising costs between 1950 and 1963 rose from $6 billion to $13 billion. People seemed eager to leave the war years behind and to forge a new, unique American identity that went hand in hand with prosperity, freedom, individualism, and the political climate of the times. President Kennedy's election in 1961, in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, to many people symbolized the triumph of American progress and prosperity, in contrast with the poverty of communist countries in the East. This is a silkscreen painting by Robert Rauschenberg in 1964, the year after Kennedy was assassinated. I wanted to show this first because it's a perfect encapsulation of the spirit of the 60s, with Kennedy's face, an eagle, a military helicopter, commercial logos, space travel, and even a set of keys which could stand for the migration from the cities to suburbia. This image shows the contrasting dynamism and growth of this time. Incidentally, this piece sold at Christie's in New York for approximately $89 million last year. Political effort was made to identify prosperity and capitalism with American political values like freedom and individuality, and advertisements sought to solidify the American identity as consumers, using advertisements to promise happiness and fulfillment. It was in this environment of booming capitalism that Neo-Dada and later pop artists came onto the scene. Both movements can be seen as responses to consumerism. Both countered the myth that the perpetual cycle of consumption and waste were able to provide consumers with contentment or give meaning to a person's life in the way the advertisements had promised. This happenings piece touches on the ideas of chance and spontaneous involvement of the participants, but it also pointedly uses consumer waste as art, these tires, which art had not done before. The foundations of these anti-consumerist ideals can be found in the philosophical leanings of John Cage, who studied Zen Buddhism, and Andy Warhol, who is a devout Ruthenian Catholic. A closer look at each of these worldviews will help us understand the art they inspired in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. John Cage, who inspired Neo-Dada, was a student of Duchamp. Like Dada, Neo-Dada probed the question about what makes something a work of art and what this tells us about the meaning of life. But the answer from Neo-Dada, true to Zen Buddhism, was optimistic, unsentimental, and even playful. The meaning of life was to be found in simplicity, in everyday moments of spontaneity and absurdity. They were calling people away from the excess and indulgence of consumer culture that only led to further emptiness. We can see this in the use of junk, hybrid materials, and spontaneous performances. This Zen image on the right of the two gibbons conveys the human habit of reaching for unrealistic things. So let's take a moment to examine the Zen precedent for anti-consumerism. University of Vermont professor Stephanie Kaza defines consumerism as a belief system and culture that promotes consuming as the path to self and social improvement. It's a complete political and economic ideology, sponsored by sophisticated marketing techniques that generate significant profits while stripping the earth of resources. As a dominant cultural force, consumerism offers products to address every dissatisfaction, while actually creating social conditions that undermine equity and environmental stability. There are three main Zen objections to consumerism. First, the idea of self is a delusion in Buddhist thought. But in consumerism, the consumer is encouraged to form a sense of self, based on all the things that they can buy. Second, a foundational principle of Buddhism is do no harm. However, consumerist practices promote excessive use and waste and indirectly condone harming the environment. Third, Buddhism teaches that desire is the source of suffering. Marketing drives people to dissatisfaction and offers every kind of product to the consumer to try to fulfill the search for more. We can see what a contrast Neo-Dada art is to the search for meaning and progress by consumerism in Rauschenberg's elemental sculptures like Music Box. He would walk around his neighborhood picking up random objects that he saw and then piece them together into sculptures. This kind of searching, in contrast to consumerism, leads to used and ordinary things, but out of it he makes art. While Neo-Dada artists playfully mocked consumerism and challenged people's understanding of art and society, pop art emerged with a pessimistic and even despairing view of consumerism. Andy Warhol's sardonic irony has often been misinterpreted as endorsement and participation in consumerism. Warhol claimed that he had no point to make and that there was no larger meaning to his work. A look at some of his quotes show why his stance on consumerism can sometimes be confusing. He said, "An artist is somebody who produces things that people don't need to have, but that he, for some reason, thinks it would be a good idea to give them. I never think that people die, they just go to department stores. Buying is much more American than thinking, and I'm as American as they come. The most beautiful thing in Tokyo is McDonald's. The most beautiful thing in Stockholm is McDonald's. The most beautiful thing in Florence is McDonald's. Peking and Moscow don't have anything beautiful yet." Crow also quotes Warhol as saying, "I want everyone to think alike. I think everybody should be a machine." But Crow points out that Warhol said these last two phrases a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis and within months of Kennedy's appearance at the Berlin Wall. Crow feels that Warhol's art purposely and ironically exposed the homogenizing effect of Western capitalism and Eastern communism, thereby exposing the hypocrisy of Western superiority and consumerism. The precedent for pop art's anti-consumerist stance can be found in Catholicism. A quote from Pope John Paul II, who is pictured here with Warhol, gives us a summary of a Catholic stance on consumerism. All of us experience the sad effects of blind submission to consumerism. In the first place, it represents crass materialism. At the same time, it represents a radical dissatisfaction, because one quickly learns that the more one possesses, the more one wants, while deeper aspirations remain unsatisfied and perhaps even stifled. Modern society will find no solution to the ecological problem unless it takes a serious look at its lifestyle. In many parts of the world, society is given to instant gratification and consumerism while remaining indifferent to the damage which these attitudes cause. Simplicity, moderation, and discipline, as well as a spirit of sacrifice, must become part of everyday life, lest all suffer the negative consequences of the careless habits of a few. Warhol meticulously searched through journals, sometimes in unpublished material, for his silk screens to make intentional statements about the contradiction between the promise of consumerism and its actual results. One such statement can be seen in Tuna Fish Disaster, an image that shows tuna cans and the faces of two women who died of poisoning from the meat. There's hardly a more ubiquitous sign for the innocuous rewards of consumerism than canned food. But the image of the two mothers taken from their families makes a foreboding statement about the underlying potential for great harm in this system. The price we pay as oblivious consumers may be far more than we could imagine. It's also important to remember that while these artists were protesting the effects of consumerism, there was a contradiction between the advertising world and social movements of these decades. Advertisements endorsed racism, sexism, and the war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, people were protesting in the civil rights movements, women's liberation, and anti-war protests. Neo-Dada and pop art are both a continuation of this confrontation with the general culture. Modern art also continued its search for the meaning of life within a rapidly shifting culture that was providing new answers of its own.